Dante Moretti slid the divorce papers across the white tablecloth, like he was closing a business deal. No hesitation, no apology, not even the decency to look her in the eye when he did it. 5 years. 5 years Isabella had stood beside this man when he had nothing but a name that scared people and a hunger that never quit. And this was how he ended it, in a restaurant, on their anniversary, with a pen already uncapped, sitting on top of the papers, like she was supposed to be grateful for the gesture. She stared at his hands, the same hands she used to hold when he was afraid, back when he actually admitted to being afraid. If you've ever loved someone so completely that you made yourself smaller just to fit inside their world, and then watched them throw you away for someone shinier, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, because what Dante Moretti did that night was only the beginning of everything he deserved to lose. The restaurant was called Fiora. It was the kind of place that didn't put prices on the menu, because if you needed to ask, you weren't supposed to be there. Crystal glasses, candles in tall silver holders, a pianist in the corner playing something soft and European that nobody actually listened to. Dante had chosen it himself, which Isabella had thought meant something. She had spent 40 minutes on her hair. She wore the dark green dress he once told her made her look like she belonged somewhere important. She understood, now that she had dressed for a funeral, without knowing it. The maîtres had seated them at a corner table, Dante's preferred spot, always with his back to the wall and a clear line of sight to both exits. Old habit. The kind of thing that stopped being charming after the 3rd year and just became part of what he was. Isabella had stopped commenting on it somewhere around year 2. She had a glass of sparkling water in front of her. She hadn't touched it. Dante sat across from her in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her first car. His dark hair was cut differently than it used to be, shorter on the sides, more deliberate. He looked like a man who had recently decided what version of himself he wanted to be, and had built the exterior accordingly. His jaw was tight. His eyes kept moving to the room around them before coming back to her face, and every time they did, Isabella felt the distance in them like a draft coming under a door. She'd felt that draft for months. She just hadn't wanted to name it. She had been rehearsing her own words all afternoon. Not a speech. Isabella was never a woman for speeches. Just a few simple sentences, the kind that changed everything. She had practiced the way she would reach across the table, the way she would watch his face shift from whatever closed-off expression he'd been carrying lately into something open, something real. She was going to tell him they were going to have a baby. Then the manila envelope appeared. Dante set it on the table with one flat, deliberate motion. No preamble. He didn't say, "I need to talk to you," or "There's something I have to tell you." He just placed it there, between the bread basket and her untouched water glass, and pulled his hand back and waited. Isabella looked at the envelope, then at him. "What is that?" "You should open it." His voice was even, controlled. The voice he used in rooms full of men who were deciding whether to be afraid of him. She had heard that voice directed at other people 100 times. It had never been aimed at her before. Her fingers found the envelope before her brain fully processed what she was doing. She pulled out the papers. She read the header once, then again, because the first time didn't make sense. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The room didn't tilt. Nothing dramatic happened. The pianist kept playing. A waiter moved past, carrying something that smelled like garlic and rosemary. Isabella sat very still and read the words on the page in front of her, and felt very precisely the sensation of the floor dropping away beneath her chair. "Dante, it's straightforward," he said. "The lawyers made it clean. You'll be taking care of the apartment, a settlement, monthly." "Stop." The word came out quieter than she intended. "Stop talking about lawyers." He stopped. He looked at her with those careful, distant eyes, and he waited, and in that waiting, she saw something that cracked something open in her chest, not cruelty, which she could have fought, but patience. He was waiting for her to absorb this so they could move forward efficiently. He had already moved forward. He was sitting here on their 5th anniversary, having already grieved, whatever this was, having already made his decision and lawyered it up and chosen the restaurant, and he was just waiting for her to catch up. 5 years, she said. "I know. 5 years, Dante." "I know how long it's been, Isabella. Do you?" She set the papers down slowly. Her hands weren't shaking. She was surprised by that. Because you're sitting across from me on our anniversary with divorce papers, and you look like you're waiting for a meeting to end. Something moved through his expression. Not guilt, she would have recognized guilt. Something closer to discomfort. The look of a man who had prepared for a version of this conversation and was now finding the actual version messier than anticipated. It's not working, he said. You know it's not working. I know things have been hard. It's more than hard. He leaned forward slightly, and his voice dropped, took on that particular gravity he used when he wanted to sound reasonable. We want different things. We've wanted different things for a long time. I'm trying to be honest with you instead of letting this go on. You're being honest with me. She repeated it back slowly, tasting each word. Yes, on our anniversary. I didn't want to ruin Christmas. The laugh that came out of her surprised them both. Short, sharp, involuntary, the kind that surfaces when something is too absurd to process any other way. A couple at the next table glanced over. Dante's jaw tightened. Isabella, you didn't want to ruin Christmas. She pressed her lips together. Looked at the table. Looked back at him. Okay, so you've been carrying these papers around since when? November? October? He didn't answer, which was its own answer. I want to understand something, she said, and her voice had gone very quiet, the way it did when she was actually serious rather than when she was performing seriousness. When you say we want different things, what do I want in your version of this? What is it that I want that doesn't fit? Dante sat back. He picked up his water glass, turned it slightly in his hand, without drinking from it, another old habit. Something to do with his hands when he was choosing words carefully. You want something simple, he said finally. Quiet. A house somewhere, a regular life. You've always wanted that. And that's not where I am. That's not where this is going. The people I deal with, the level I'm operating at, now it requires something different. A different kind of partnership. He paused. Set the glass down. I'm not the same man you married, Isabella. You deserve someone who can give you what you want. It was well constructed. She could recognize that even in the moment, the way he had framed it as concern for her, as though the divorce papers were an act of generosity. She had watched him negotiate rooms full of dangerous men for 5 years, and she knew exactly how he built an argument to make the other person feel like they were being offered something rather than having something taken. Is there someone else? The pause was just a half-second too long. I'm not asking to fight, she said. I'm asking because I deserve an actual answer. There's someone I've been spending time with, he said. Nothing has happened, but I won't lie to you about what it could become. He absorbed that. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice was already connecting the dots she'd been refusing to connect for months. The late nights that used to feel like business and lately felt different. The way his phone faced down on tables. The new cologne she hadn't bought him. Who is she? Who is she, Dante? He held her gaze. Valentina Rizzo. The name landed differently than she expected. Not because she didn't know it, she knew exactly who Valentina Rizzo was. Carlo Rizzo's daughter, 29 years old, educated in Milan, beautiful in the way that cost significant money to maintain, and embedded in a world of power and visibility that Isabella had never been part of, and had never wanted to be part of. And that, she realized, was the point. She's one of them, Isabella said quietly. She belongs to that world. It's not about that. Dante, it's not only about that. Something settled in Isabella's chest. Not quite grief would come later. She already knew that. It was waiting for her, somewhere in the next few hours like weather on the horizon. What settled now was a particular kind of clarity that arrives, when a thing you've been half-seeing finally steps fully into the light. She had always known that the empire he was building would eventually require a different version of his life. She had tried to grow into it with him, tried to learn the right way to stand in rooms full of people who had been born into this world when she had only married into it. She had dressed the way he preferred and kept the confidences he needed, kept and asked no questions about things she understood. She wasn't supposed to ask about. And she had done all of this not because she was afraid of him, but because she loved him, the actual him, the man underneath the title, who's used to sit at their kitchen table at 2 a.m. eating cereal and telling her about the future, like a kid who couldn't believe his luck. That man was apparently now the property of history. Sign them or don't, Dante said quietly, but I need you to understand that this decision is made. She looked at the papers again. Then she folded them carefully, the way she might fold a letter she intended to keep, and place them in her purse. "I'll have my attorney look at them," she said. He blinked. He had expected tears, she realized, or anger, something he could manage. The calm with which she put the papers away seemed to unsettle him more than anything else she might have done. She picked up her purse and stood. "Isabella, happy anniversary, Dante." She walked out of Fiora without looking back. She kept her spine straight, and her chin level, and her hands loose at her sides, and she didn't let the air out of her lungs until she was through the door, and on the sidewalk in the October cold, where the city noise swallowed her up, and she was anonymous again. Just a woman in a dark green dress standing on a Manhattan street with a secret in her body and divorce papers in her bag, and 5 years of her life folding up like a letter behind her. She stood there for a moment, just breathing. Then she took out her phone and made a call she had not made in 5 years. It rang 3 times, Isabella. Her father's voice older than she remembered it, but steady in the same way stone was steady. Vittorio Bellandi did not do emotional greetings. He simply said her name and waited. "Papa," she said. Her voice didn't break. She was proud of that. "I need to come home." A silence that contained many things. "The car will be there in 20 minutes, he said. She had left her father's world when she was 22 years old, not out of fear, but out of a particular kind of stubbornness that she had inherited directly from the man she was calling. She had wanted to be loved for herself, not for her last name or the weight it carried or the doors it opened. She had met Dante Moretti at a gallery opening, not a family function, not a business dinner, just a regular night in a city full of people, and he had been charming and sharp and a little dangerous, and she had thought, "This is mine. This is a choice I made for myself. This is love that belongs to me." She had been so careful to keep Dante separate from Vittorio. She had given Dante a different version of her history, a father in import-export, minimal contact, estranged in the polite way that people accepted without digging. The story wasn't built to last forever, but she had never imagined needing it to. Now, standing on a sidewalk in October, with his child growing quietly inside her, she understood that the story was over. She had one decision to make before the car arrived. Whether to tell Dante about the pregnancy. She turned it over in her mind, the way you turn over something broken, looking for the piece that still holds. If she told him, he would pause. The divorce would slow down, maybe stop. And she could see exactly how that version played out. Dante staying not because he chose her, but because he felt trapped. The resentment building slowly over years. Valentina Rizzo waiting in the background. The child growing up inside a house where one parent was present under obligation. She had watched that movie before, she knew how it ended. If she didn't tell him, if she walked away, she protected the child from being born into a war. She protected herself from being a transaction. And she gave Dante exactly what he thought he wanted, which was the freedom to discover whether he actually wanted it. The decision, when it came, didn't feel like a decision. It felt like a door closing on its own. The black car arrived in 19 minutes. She got in without looking up at the restaurant windows. She didn't know if Dante was watching. She didn't want to know. The car moved through the city, and Isabella sat in the back seat, with her hands folded in her lap, and thought about the moment she would have to tell her father what had happened, and felt, underneath the weight of everything, a complicated relief. The kind that comes when a thing you've been dreading finally arrives, and turns out to be survivable. Vittorio Bellandi lived in a house in Westchester that looked from the outside like the home of a successful but unremarkable businessman. 4 bedrooms, a well-maintained garden, a gate that required a code. What it looked like on the inside, and what moved in and out of it, was a separate matter entirely. He was waiting for her in the study. He stood when she entered. He always stood. When she entered a room, it was a habit so old it had become reflex, and he looked at her face for a moment with the particular attention of a man who read people the way other men read documents. "Sit down," he said. She sat. The leather chair was familiar. She had sat in it as a child, waiting while her father finished calls, drawing patterns on the armrest with her finger. "Tell me," she told him. Not everything, not yet the pregnancy she kept back, the name Bellandi, the 5 years of careful architecture she had built to keep these 2 lives separate. She told him about the restaurant, the papers, Dante's voice, Valentina Rizzo's name in his mouth. Vittorio listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How long have you been married?" 5 years. "And in 5 years Dante Moretti did not know your last name." My real last name. No. Another silence. She watched her father's face and recognized the expression on it, not anger, not yet. The thing before anger, the thing that was colder than anger and more dangerous because it didn't need an outlet immediately. It could wait. Pop, you're pregnant. She froze. She hadn't said a word. Vittorio looked at her with something patient and devastating in his eyes. I'm your father, Isabella. I've known since you walked in. She exhaled. The air left her body in a long, slow release. Yes. He knows? No. You're not going to tell him. It wasn't a question. No, he nodded once. The way he nodded when a decision had been made in a meeting and the discussion portion was concluded. She recognized that nod. She had grown up watching it close doors. Then we just discuss it further tonight, he said. You'll stay here. Tomorrow I'll have someone bring your things from the apartment. Papa, I know what you don't want. His voice was quiet and final. But Dante Moretti has just made himself my concern. What I do about that is my business. What you do is yours. He paused. You're home now. That's enough for tonight. Isabella sat in the leather chair that smelled like old paper and her father's specific brand of cigarette, and she did not cry, because Bellandi women did not cry in front of their fathers. She pressed her lips together and nodded, and felt, despite everything, the particular safety of being somewhere she had been, before somewhere that had its own rules and its own weight and would not move beneath her feet. She had no idea what her father was already thinking. And Dante Moretti had no idea who he had just divorced. The morning after Isabella walked out of Fiora, Dante Moretti went to his office in the Garment District building that functioned as the visible front of several less visible operations, and he sat behind his desk and told himself he felt nothing but clarity. He was good at that. Clarity was a tool. He had learned to pick it up and use it the way other men picked up a weapon deliberately when the situation required it and set it back down when it didn't. The dinner had gone as planned. Isabella had taken the papers. She hadn't made a scene. He had expected a scene, and the absence of one left a small discomfort in him that he declined to examine. Marcus Vance knocked at the open door. His right hand 4 years in the position, a man who had a gift for appearing in rooms at exactly the right moment. You're good? I'm good, Dante said. Marcus stepped in and closed the door. He sat across the desk in the way that meant this wasn't a social visit. Valentina called. Dante's posture didn't change. And she wants to know if last night went fine. He pulled a folder toward him. Set up a meeting with the Rizzo people for Thursday. I want the partnership terms on the table before the month is out. Marcus nodded slowly. He had a particular kind of nod that was not quite agreement, and not quite question a nod that was really a pause. Dante had learned to notice that nod. Something you want to say? No, Marcus. Marcus looked at the window behind Dante's head for a moment. Isabella's a good woman. Yes, Dante said, she is. That's not what this is about. Right, it's not. Marcus nodded again, the real nod this time, the functional one. Thursday, then. I'll set it up. He stood. You eat anything this morning? Dante had not eaten anything that morning. I'm fine. Yeah, Marcus moved to the door. You look it. He left. Dante sat alone with the folder he wasn't actually reading, and the city noise coming up through the windows from 6 floors below, and he thought about the dark green dress and the way Isabella had walked out of the restaurant not storming, not stumbling, just walking, as though she had somewhere specific to be, and then he made himself stop thinking about it and picked up his phone. Valentina answered on the first ring. Tell me it's done, she said. It's done, he said. The satisfaction in her voice was warm and immediate, and he let it fill whatever space the morning had left empty. He had made his choice. He had made the right choice. He almost believed it by noon. 48 hours after Isabella arrived at her father's house, she was sitting in the kitchen eating toast when Vittorio walked in with his phone in his hand and a look on his face that she had not seen since she was 16 years old and a man had made the mistake of, threatening their family at an event her father had hosted. He looked in that moment extraordinarily calm. Papa, what happened? Nothing has happened, he said. He poured coffee. He stood at the counter and drank it. He did not look at her. How are you feeling this morning? Don't do that. He looked up. Don't ask me how I'm feeling when you're already planning something, she said. I'm not 16. I know what that face means. Vittorio was quiet for a moment. Then he set down his cup. He sat at the table across from her in the chair that was his chair, Always the one with the specific view of both the door and the window. Dante Moretti, he said, built his empire on structures that were never as solid as he believed. He's clever, he's ruthless. He has loyalty from men who are afraid of him, an ambition that has kept him expanding in a market where expansion gets people killed. He paused. But he has never in 5 years of sitting across from him at tables as I was, at long before he was born, understood who the money actually answers to. Isabella set down her toast. "What have you done?" she said quietly. "Nothing yet." He looked at her. "I want you to understand something before anything begins. I'm about to do. I'm not doing because he hurt you. Men hurt women. That's a personal matter." His voice was the same temperature it always was, which was the temperature of a room that has had the heat off for a long time. "I'm doing it because he sat at tables where I had eyes and ears and influence, and he treated my daughter as a woman he could discard. That makes it a professional matter. And professional matters have different remedies. The child you're carrying," he said, "will never have to know what his father was. That's the only thing I care about." He picked up his coffee again. "The rest is just business." She looked at her father, this man she had spent 5 years running away from, this man whose world she had rejected, because she wanted something that felt like it belonged to her, and she felt something complicated and honest move through her. She was not innocent about what her father was or what he was capable of. She had never been innocent about it. She had left not because she didn't love him, but because she had understood young that staying in that world meant becoming a particular kind of person, and she had wanted to see if there was a different version of herself available. There was. She had built it, piece by piece, over 5 years. And Dante had just burned it down. She said nothing more to her father that morning. She finished her toast. She drank her tea. And she decided clearly and without drama that she was going to let Vittorio Bellandi do whatever Vittorio Bellandi was going to do. Because the man who had handed her divorce papers on their anniversary had made his choice. Now she was making hers. What neither of them knew, not Dante, not Valentina Rizzo, not the allied families who had watched Dante Moretti's empire expand over 5 years with cautious admirations, was that Vittorio Bellandi had been patient for precisely as long as his daughter had been married. And patience in men like Vittorio was never idle. It was productive. For 5 years, while Isabella kept her secret and her husband built his empire, her father had been watching, learning the architecture of Dante's operations, understanding where the weight was carried and where the supports were thinner than they looked. He had done this not out of malice, or not only out of malice, but because Vittorio Bellandi had not survived 63 years in a world designed to kill men like him by trusting that things would be fine. He trusted information. He trusted preparation. He trusted the kind of leverage that looked, from the outside, like coincidence. By the time Isabella was sitting in his kitchen eating toast, the first calls had already been made. By the time she went to bed that night, 3 of the financial institutions managing Dante Moretti's most sensitive accounts had received documentation that would require them, under legal obligation, to review their client relationships. By the end of the week, reviews would become freezes. Dante didn't know it yet. He was in a restaurant in Midtown, a different restaurant from Fiora, a newer one, trendier, the kind with no right angles and a menu that described itself in 7 languages, and he was sitting across from Valentina Rizzo and telling her that everything had been handled. Valentina was beautiful in the way that made rooms rearrange themselves. She had a quality that Isabella had never had, a presence that was loud even when she was silent, that demanded acknowledgement from every space she entered. She wore her family status like architecture. You noticed her the way you noticed a building. She reached across the table and touched Dante's hand. "It was the right thing," she said. "You know it was." "I know," he said. "She never fit, Dante. I know you cared about her. But she was never part of this world." He nodded. He looked at Valentina's hand on his. He told himself that the thing sitting in his chest was the relief of a difficult thing being finished. He told himself that for the rest of the evening, with reasonable success. It was only later, alone, that the dark green dress appeared behind his eyes again, the straightness of Isabella's spine, as she walked out the door, the particular quiet with which she had folded those papers, and he found himself wondering, not for the last time, what she had been about to say before the envelope appeared on the table. She had come into the restaurant, prepared to say something. He had seen it on her face, that particular gathering of breath. He had placed the envelope down before she could begin. He had never found out what it was. He fell asleep telling himself it didn't matter. Dante slept 4 hours that night, which was 2 more than he expected. He was up before 6, standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse apartment with a cup of coffee he'd made himself because the housekeeper didn't arrive until 8, and he had never been the kind of man who waited for someone else to make his coffee. The city below was still in that particular pre-dawn state where the lights outnumbered the people and everything looked cleaner than it actually was. He liked this hour. It was the one time the city felt like it belonged to him, instead of the other way around. His phone was on the counter. He'd checked it twice already. Nothing from Marcus that couldn't wait. Nothing from the lawyers. Nothing from Isabella, which he had expected and which produced, when he confirmed it, a sensation he filed under relief and moved past quickly. He showered, he dressed. He was out of the apartment by 7:15. The office felt different that morning, though nothing in it had changed. Same desk, same view, same framed photographs of properties and operations that represented 15 years of building something from blood and borrowed time. Dante sat behind the desk and opened his laptop and pulled up the morning's financial summaries the way he did every day, and the numbers were where they should be, and everything was fine. Marcus arrived at 8 with 2 coffees and a look on his face. "You're going to tell me something I don't want to hear," Dante said without looking up. "The Caruso account." Marcus set 1 coffee in front of him. "The bank flagged it." Dante looked up then. "Flagged how?" "Compliance review. Came in last night. They're requesting documentation on 3 transactions from Q3. He sat down. "Could be routine. Is it routine?" Marcus turned the coffee cup in his hands. "The timing's not great." The timing. Dante closed the laptop. "We closed the Fiora deal last month. We moved funds through Caruso 6 weeks ago. If someone is looking at Q3, it could be nothing. Banks do these sweeps. Banks do these sweeps when someone tells them to do these sweeps." Dante's voice was level, but there was something new underneath it, a vibration that wasn't quite there yet, but was finding its frequency. "Get me Caruso's manager today. He's not going to tell you who." "I know what he's not going to tell me. I want to look at his face when he doesn't tell me." Dante picked up his coffee. "And get me Ferraro on the phone. I want to know if anyone in the legal layer has been contacted." Marcus nodded and left. Dante sat alone with his coffee, and the summary he was no longer reading, and the particular kind of stillness that settles over a man who has spent 15 years learning to recognize when something is coming before it arrives. Something was coming. He didn't know what. He didn't know from which direction. But the compliance flag on the Caruso account was a thread, and threads didn't appear by themselves, and the only question was whether he pulled it or waited to see what was attached to the other end. He pulled out his personal phone and called Valentina. She answered on the 3rd ring, slightly breathless, the way she always was, in the morning a quality he had found charming, and was finding this morning slightly irritating. "I need a conversation with your father," he said. "This week." A pause. "Is something wrong?" "Probably nothing. I want a conversation with Carlo regardless. Can you set it up?" "I can ask." "Dante, what's going on?" "I'll know more by tonight. Can you set up the meeting or not?" The brief silence on her end had a texture to it. "Yes," she said. "I'll ask him." "Good." He hung up. He sat for another moment. Then he picked up the desk phone and called his head of security, a man named Pollard who had 3 qualities Dante valued: competence, silence, and no imagination whatsoever. "I need you to run something," Dante said when he answered. Quietly. "I want to know if there's been any unusual activity around any of our financial contacts in the last 2 weeks. Not criminal activity. Social activity. Meetings, dinners, phone calls from unfamiliar numbers. The kind of thing that doesn't get logged anywhere, but that people notice." "That's a wide net," Pollard said. "Start close and work out. And Pollard, this stays between us until I say otherwise." "Understood." He hung up, drank his coffee. The city outside was fully awake now, noise rising, the illusion of cleanliness dissolving into the actual thing below. He told himself it was a compliance flag. Routine. Banks ran reviews all the time. He almost believed it. Across the city, in the Westchester house with its unremarkable exterior and its very particular interior, Isabella was eating breakfast for the 2nd time in 2 days at her father's table, and she was not thinking about Dante. She was thinking about the appointment she had at 11 o'clock, with the doctor her father had arranged, not her regular physician, not anyone who might appear in any file connected to her old address or her old name. A private practice in the West 60s. A woman her father vouched for with the specific economy of words he used when the vouching was absolute. She was 12 weeks along. She had known for 3 weeks. She had been carrying it alone for 3 weeks, which was not a long time in any ordinary measure, and felt, in the specific way that significant secrets do, like it had been years. The nausea had been manageable. She was grateful for that, not because she couldn't handle the alternative, but because visible difficulty would have given her father additional fuel, and Vittorio Bellandi didn't need additional fuel. He appeared in the kitchen doorway at 8:30, already dressed, already having made calls she would never be told about. He had a quality she had forgotten over 5 years of distance, the way he occupied a room, not by taking up space, but by making the room understand that he was in it. She had never met another person who did this in exactly the same way. "Doctor at 11, he said. "I know, Rosa will drive you." "I can drive myself." He looked at her. "Papa, I'm pregnant, I'm not incapacitated." "Rosa will drive you," he said again, with the identical inflection, and moved to the counter to pour his coffee. Isabella decided that this was not the fight she wanted to have at 8:30 in the morning. She had a limited budget for these conversations, and she intended to spend it wisely. "Fine." He sat across from her with his cup, and looked at her with the careful, assessing attention she remembered from her adolescence, the look that was not intrusive, but was also not gentle, the look of a man who was cataloging information. "You slept," he said. "Some. Good." He drank his coffee. Set the cup down. "I want to talk to you about something." "Not about Dante, about you." He folded his hands on the table. "I've been in contact with Patricia Sung." Isabella looked up sharply. Patricia Sung ran the Bellandi Family Foundation, the legitimate face of her father's influence, the charitable organization that had been a real and functional thing for 20 years, even if its funding origins were complicated. It managed arts grants, housing initiatives, healthcare access programs across the tri-state area. Isabella had grown up, watching her father write the checks that funded it, and she had spent 3 years in her early 20s working within it before she left. "Why are you talking to Patricia?" "Because the foundation needs a director of development," he said. "The position has been open for 4 months. Patricia has been managing it alongside her other responsibilities, and she is, as you might imagine, not pleased about that. Pup, I'm not asking you to make a decision." His voice was even and unhurried. "I'm telling you what exists. A position, a structure, something that already has your history in it." He looked at his cup. "You built something real in those 3 years. Patricia has not forgotten that." "I haven't forgotten that." Isabella set down her fork. She looked at her father, this man who communicated love entirely through the arrangement of practical things, who would never say, "I'm glad you're home," but would instead offer her a career and a driver, and an appointment with the best private OB in Manhattan. And she felt, underneath her complicated feelings about all of it, a current of something that might have been gratitude. "Let me get through the next few weeks," she said. "Of course. And I'm not making any decisions about anything until after the first trimester." "Understood. And the driver thing is temporary." Vittorio picked up his cup again. Something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. Naturally. She went back to her breakfast. He went back to his coffee. The kitchen was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when the people in them have reached a temporary equilibrium. Neither of them mentioned Dante. Neither of them needed to. The bank manager's name was Heilman, and he met Dante at a private room in the Caruso financial offices on Park Avenue at 2:15 that afternoon, with the kind of carefully maintained composure that told Dante everything he needed to know about how uncomfortable the man actually was. Mr. Moretti, Heilman extended a hand. His grip was firm, but his palm was slightly damp. "I appreciate you coming in. This could easily have been handled through your financial team." "I prefer face-to-face," Dante said. He sat. He did not unbutton his jacket. He put his hands flat on the table in front of him and looked at Hillman with the specific quality of attention that had, over the years, caused men considerably larger and more confident than Hillman to start talking before they'd planned to. Hillman sat. He opened a folder. He began explaining the compliance review, in the language of compliance review's regulatory language, risk management language, the vocabulary of institutional ass-covering, and Dante listened without expression and without interruption, until the man ran out of prepared phrasing, and the room got quiet. "Who requested the review?" Dante said. "These reviews are internally generated. I've worked with this bank for 6 years. I've moved significant money through this institution without a single compliance flag. Last week you flagged 3 transactions." He kept his voice low and conversational. "Who requested it?" Heilmann's composure held, but just barely. "Mr. Moretti, I'm not at liberty to share the specifics of—" "I'm not asking you to read me the file." Dante leaned forward slightly. "I'm asking you to tell me whether someone outside this institution contacted your compliance division in the last 2 weeks." "Silence." "That silence," Dante said quietly, "is an answer." Heilmann's hands moved on the folder. He straightened papers that didn't need straightening. "I'm afraid I can't do." Dante stood. He buttoned his jacket. He was already calculating not the meeting he was in, but the next one, and the one after that, and what the pattern looked like from a distance. "Thank you for your time." He was in the car before he allowed himself to process it. Someone had reached the bank. Someone with enough credibility in financial circles to prompt a compliance review without leaving a visible fingerprint on it. Someone who understood which accounts to look at and how to apply the right kind of pressure through the right kind of channels. This was not a competitor. Competitors didn't operate this way. Competitors sent men, or they sent lawyers, or they sent fire. This was someone who understood the architecture of his operations from the inside. He called Marcus from the car. "The Caruso flag," he said. Someone external initiated it. Someone with serious reach into financial compliance channels. He paused. "I want you to compile every significant meeting Isabella attended with me in the last 3 years. Every dinner, every event, every room she sat in where business was discussed." A silence on Marcus's end that lasted a moment too long. "Marcus, I'm here, another beat." "Dante, what are you thinking?" "I don't know yet. Just pull it." He hung up and looked out the car window and felt something cold and specific move through his chest. Not fear. Something adjacent to fear with sharper edges. Isabella had sat in a lot of rooms over 5 years. She had been quiet in those rooms, attentive, composed, the kind of presence that men in his business tended to underestimate because she was beautiful and soft-spoken and produced no visible agenda. He had never asked himself, not once in 5 years, whether that quietness was its own kind of intelligence. He was asking himself now. The meeting with Carlo Rizzo happened 2 days later, in a private dining room at a club on the Upper East Side, where Carlo was a member and Dante was a guest, which was itself a small but deliberate statement about the geometry of the conversation. Carlo Rizzo was 61 years old and looked like 61 years of specific decisions made by a man who had never had to apologize for any of them. He was broad-shouldered and silver-haired and ate his lunch with the unhurried attention of someone who had nowhere more important to be another deliberate signal. Valentina was not present. She had arranged the meeting and then been excluded from it, which had produced a conversation between her and Dante the night before. He was still carrying the residue of. "My father wants to talk to you alone," she had told him. "That's fine. It's not a bad sign." She had said it with just enough emphasis to suggest she wasn't sure it wasn't a bad sign. "I'll see him tomorrow," Dante had said. She'd touched his face. He'd let her. And then he'd been alone with the ceiling and the quiet and the feeling that had been following him around for a week now, not quite guilt, not quite worry, something between the two that didn't have a clean name. Now he sat across from Carlo Rizzo and watched the man cut his lamb chop and waited. Carlo ate 2 bites before he spoke. "You want to talk about the Bellandi question?" Dante's jaw tightened. "What Bellandi question?" Carlo set down his fork. He looked at Dante with the particular directness of a man who had decided that a conversation was going to be honest, whether the other person was ready for that or not. "Vittorio Bellandi has been making calls," he said. "Not loud calls. Quiet ones. The kind that move things without making noise." He picked up his wine glass. "He's been moving through your financial infrastructure the way water moves through stone." Slowly, without announcing itself, he drank. Set the glass down. 3 institutions have been contacted. Probably more by now. The cold thing in Dante's chest got colder. "Bellandi has no connection to me." Carlo looked at him. "He has no connection," Dante said again, and heard, even as he said it, the way it sounded. "Your wife," Carlo said carefully, "what do you know about her family?" The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. To anyone watching, it might have appeared that nothing happened in those 4 seconds. Dante's expression didn't change. His posture didn't shift. His hands remained still on the table. But inside those 4 seconds, a very large number of things rearranged themselves. Isabella's careful vagueness whenever the subject of her father came up. The way she deflected rather than denied. The specific quality of her composure in rooms full of men who should have made her nervous and somehow didn't. The way she had walked out of Fiora not wounded, not shattered, but composed, as though she was going somewhere specific and certain. Her father's name, Dante said slowly. Carlo looked at him across the table with something that might have been pity if Carlo Rizzo were a man capable of pity in the traditional sense. Vittorio Bellandi, he said. She's his only daughter. The lamb chop sat between them, getting cold. Dante said nothing for what felt like a long time. Carlo let him have the silence. He was, for all his faults, a man who understood the value of letting information land before you started building on top of it. She never told you, Carlo said. It was not a question. No, 5 years. No, Dante's voice was even, very even. The way it got when he was working hard to keep something contained. She never told me. Carlo nodded slowly. He picked up his fork again. Bellandi has been retired from active operations for 11 years. But retired is a relative word for a man like that. His reach into financial and legal networks is, he paused, selected a word carefully. Significant. He built it over 40 years. It doesn't disappear because he's no longer attending meetings. He ate. He also has very few weaknesses. His health is good. His operation runs without him now because he trained it to. And he has one child. He looked at Dante. One child who you just divorced. Dante's hand was flat on the table. He was aware of it being flat on the table. He was aware of the pressure of his palm against the linen. Why are you telling me this? He said. Carlo set down his fork again and looked at him directly. Because my daughter has told me she intends not to align herself with you. And before that happens, I need to understand what I'm aligning with. He was quiet for a moment. What I'm currently looking at is a man whose financial base is being systematically dismantled by Vittorio Bellandi, who has cause, means, and from what I understand, considerable motivation. He picked up his wine. I'm telling you, because you need to know the shape of what you're dealing with. And because I am not, at this time, prepared to put my organization between you and Bellandi. Dante absorbed this. You're not going to help me, he said. I'm having lunch with you, Carlo said. That's what I'm prepared to do at this time. The drive back to the office was 15 minutes. Dante spent all 15 of them in absolute silence. And Marcus, who had been doing this long enough to know the difference between the kinds of silences, did not say a word. Back at the desk, Dante called Pollard. What do you have? 2 more institutions, Pollard said. Both received documentation in the last 72 hours. Standard on the surface regulatory language, compliance framing, but the documentation is thorough. Whoever prepared it understood your operational structure in specific detail. A pause. Dante, this isn't someone who got a tip. This is someone who did homework. A lot of it, over a long time. Dante was quiet. There's something else, Pollard said. The documentation references accounts that aren't in any public record. Shell structures that were never meant to be visible from outside. Another pause. Someone had access to information that was never supposed to leave your immediate circle. The word circle sat in the room. Dante thought about Isabella sitting across from him at dinners. Isabella listening. Isabella asking occasionally quiet questions that he had answered because she was his wife and he trusted her, and the questions seemed incidental. He thought about 5 years of incidental. Pollard, he said. Is there any way to trace when this information was gathered? The timeline. Working on it. But Dante, the man paused again, and Pollard didn't pause. Pollard delivered information with the affect of someone reading a weather report. The fact that he was pausing told Dante more than the words did. If I had to guess from what I'm seeing, this wasn't gathered last week. The depth of it, the specificity, this is years of accumulation. Dante sat very still. Years, he said. Yeah, he hung up. He sat in the office with the door closed, and the city outside doing what cities did, and he thought about Isabella Bellandi, because that was her name. He understood now. That was who she had been the entire time, and he tried to construct a version of the last 5 years in which everything made sense from this new angle. It didn't quite hold together. That was the thing that kept snagging at him. If she'd been a plant, if Vittorio had placed her deliberately, then Dante was simply a mark, and the last 5 years were theater. But that wasn't what it felt like from the inside, and Dante trusted his instincts about people, even when those instincts occasionally failed him. She hadn't been placed. She had simply never volunteered the truth. There was a difference. The question was what she had done with what she knew. He pulled out his phone. He looked at her number. The contact still said Isabella with the small green circle that indicated her phone was active. He could call her. He could demand an explanation. He could be furious, which was his first instinct, and the one he'd been trained by 15 years of this life to reach for when he felt exposed. Instead, he set the phone face down on the desk, because demanding explanations from Vittorio Bellandi's daughter was not a card he could play without knowing what cards he had left. And the answer to that question was becoming, with every passing hour, more uncomfortable than the last. Marcus came in without knocking, which he only did when something couldn't wait. He had a page in his hand, and his face had the expression of a man who had just read something and was still deciding how to say it out loud. "The warehouse on Pelham," he said. Dante looked up. "We got a call 20 minutes ago." Marcus put the page on the desk. "The leaseholder is terminating the agreement, effective in 30 days. He paused. "Same leaseholder has been with us for 7 years. Never had a problem." Dante looked at the page. "And the distribution point in the Bronx," Marcus continued. "We got a letter today. The building's been sold. New owners want vacant possession." He sat down. His voice was careful and professional, but underneath it was something that Dante recognized as the particular unease of a man watching familiar ground shift. "That's 3 financial flags and 2 property moves in 1 week, Dante. I know, if this is coordinated, it's coordinated." Dante picked up the page. "Set it down. How much runway do we have? If the Caruso accounts are frozen and the Pelham warehouse is gone." Marcus was quiet for a moment, 6 months maybe, if nothing else moves. "But if the Bellandi connections go where I think they go," he stopped. "Say it. If Vittorio Bellandi has been working this, for as long as Pollard thinks, there may be more pressure points we haven't seen yet. Things set up and waiting to activate." He looked at Dante directly. "We might already be inside the collapse and not know it yet." Dante stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there with his hands in his pockets and looked at the city that had always looked from up here like something he owned. He had walked out of Fiora 8 days ago, feeling like a man who had put his life in order. He had handed Isabella divorce papers and told himself he was making a rational choice. He had told himself she was ordinary, quiet, too far removed from his world. He understood now, with a clarity that was its own kind of punishment, that he had been looking at Vittorio Bellandi's daughter and calling her ordinary. He had looked at a woman who had sat in his rooms and listened and remembered and protected a secret for 5 years out of nothing, but the determination to be loved for herself, and he had called her a poor fit. The city looked the same as it always had, but the ground under it was different now. Behind him, Marcus said nothing. He had the intelligence to say nothing. Dante stood at the window and felt the shape of what was coming the way you feel weather before it arrives, in the pressure of the air and the quality of the light, and he understood with the part of him that had always been better at reading situations than at reading people that the decision he had made at a restaurant table 8 days ago was not, as he had believed, the end of something. It was the moment everything actually began. The call from Pollard came at 6:47 in the morning, 3 days after the meeting with Carlo Rizzo, and the fact that Pollard was calling before 7 meant that whatever he had found was not the kind of thing that could wait until business hours. Dante answered on the first ring. "Talk the Pelham warehouse," Pollard said. "I went back through the ownership chain on the building. The leaseholder, who terminated his parent company, changed hands 8 months ago." A pause. "The acquiring entity traces through 4 shell layers to a holding structure in Delaware." Another pause. "Delaware structure is controlled by a trust. Trust beneficiary is a private foundation." The pause this time was longer. "Foundation is registered under the name Bellandi." Dante sat up in bed. The room was dark. He hadn't slept well. He hadn't slept well in 3 days. 8 months ago, he said. "Yes, that's 4 months, before I filed the papers." Yes, he was quiet. Outside, the city was doing its pre-dawn thing, that particular quality of noise that was less noise than the absence of full silence, the the city breathing through the night. How far back does it go, Dante said. The preparation. Your best estimate. Pollard took a moment. The Delaware structure was established 3 years ago. The trust predates that. If I had to put a number on when the groundwork started, when someone began building the infrastructure to do exactly what's being done right now, he paused. I'd say 5 years, give or take. 5 years. Dante held the phone against his ear and looked at the dark ceiling of his bedroom and felt something move through him that wasn't anger yet, wasn't fully formed enough to be anger, was instead the raw material of it, the cold, nauseating recognition of the specific shape of a thing you should have seen. 5 years, he said. His voice was flat, controlled. The way it got when the control was costing him something. I can't be certain, Pollard said. But yeah, that's what it looks like. He hung up. He sat on the edge of the bed. He put both feet on the floor and his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands and stayed there for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. Then he stood up, dressed, made coffee, and stood at the window, in the same spot he'd stood in every morning for 5 years while the city got light, and he thought about Isabella Bellandi making coffee in this kitchen. Sitting in this apartment, sleeping in this room, moving through 5 years of his life, like a woman who had nothing but love to offer him, and nothing to hide. He thought about the question he'd turned over 3 days ago, and hadn't been able to answer cleanly, whether she'd been placed deliberately or had simply kept her own counsel. 5 years of groundwork told him one thing. The way she'd looked at him, the particular quality of it, that was real. He would have staked 15 years of reading people on that told him another. He couldn't make both things true at the same time. He was still trying to make them fit when his phone rang again at 8, and this time it was Marcus. And the sound of Marcus's voice, tight controlled, one register below what it should have been told him, that the day was going to be worse than the night had been. You need to come in, Marcus said. Now. What happened? Just come in, Dante. He was at the office in 20 minutes. Marcus met him in the lobby instead of upstairs, which had never happened before in 4 years. They rode the elevator in silence. The doors opened and Dante stepped into his own office floor and stopped. There were men in his conference room who should not have been there. 3 of them, in suits that were not the kind of suits. His people wore institutional suits, the kind that came with credentials. They were seated at his conference table with folders open in front of them, and through the glass wall, Dante could see that the folders contained documents he recognized even from a distance. His own documents. Marcus spoke quietly at his shoulder. They came in at 7:30. Credentials check out, they're legitimate. Federal Financial Crimes Unit, cross-referencing with State Fraud Division. He paused. They have a warrant, Dante. For what specifically? The accounts, Caruso and 4 others. They've already been in contact with the institutions, a breath. The accounts are frozen. All of them. The conference room glass reflected his own face back at him. He looked, in that reflection, like a man who was processing a very large amount of information in a very small space of time, which was accurate. Where's Ferraro? He said. Ferraro was his attorney. On his way. 20 minutes. Nobody talks to them till Ferraro is in the room. Already told them. Dante looked at the 3 men in his conference room. One of them looked up and met his gaze through the glass with the specific blankness of someone who had done this enough times that the power dynamics no longer interested them. Just paperwork. Just another morning. Dante turned away from the glass. The accounts, he said. All of them, all of them. He walked to his desk. He sat down. He put his hands flat on the surface and breathed through his nose. For a moment, deliberately, the way he'd learned to breathe in rooms where losing composure was something other people did. Get me Valentina, he said. Get me Valentina, Marcus. Marcus left. Dante sat at the desk and looked at his hands and thought about Vittorio Bellandi, who he had never met, whose name he had heard in rooms for 15 years as a reference point, a benchmark, a man who represented a tier of operation so far above street-level crime that the 2 worlds barely touched. A man who had retired from active operations 11 years ago and had apparently spent the subsequent decade building a machine specifically designed to dismantle the empire of whatever man was foolish enough to divorce his daughter. And the machine had started 5 years ago, which meant it had started when Isabella married him. Which meant Vittorio Bellandi had spent 5 years preparing for a possibility that he had hoped would never become a reality. That was not the logic of a man engineering a betrayal. That was the logic of a father who understood the world his daughter had married into, who had watched from a distance and built a contingency, who had loved her enough to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. Dante sat with this for a long time. Then Ferraro arrived, and the three men from the Federal Financial Crimes Unit stopped being an abstract threat and became a concrete one, and there was no more time for sitting. The meeting in the conference room took 2 hours. Ferraro was good. He was the best Dante had ever worked with, technically brilliant, pathologically composed, and he managed the conversation with the careful precision of a surgeon working near something vital. He had not acknowledged nothing, committed to nothing, and extracted the specific scope of the warrant with enough clarity that by the end of the meeting, they understood exactly what was frozen and exactly what the government believed they had. What the government believed they had was, Dante understood as the meeting progressed quite a lot. The documentation was thorough, exhaustively thorough. The kind of thorough that took years to build, that required intimate knowledge of the operational structure, that could not have been assembled from outside. After the federal agents left, Ferraro closed the conference room door and turned to Dante with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally quite grave. "I need you to be honest with me," Ferraro said, "not as your attorney. As someone who needs to understand the situation completely before I can help you." He sat down at the table. This documentation, the level of specificity in it, this didn't come from a surveillance operation. This came from someone who was inside. He looked at Dante directly. Who had access to these structures? Dante looked at the table. Who had access, Dante? "I'm working on that," he said. Ferraro looked at him for a moment. "Work faster," he said. "Because whoever built this case for them did it with the kind of detail that makes my job very, very difficult." He paused. "The accounts are frozen. That's the immediate problem. The criminal exposure is the second problem, and it's larger. But the source of this information is the problem underneath all the other problems." He closed his folder. "Find the source," he left. Dante sat alone in the conference room, for the first time that morning, and the room was very quiet, and he looked at the place on the table where the federal agents had put their folders, and he thought about the word source. He knew where the source was. He just didn't know how to prove it, or whether proving it was even the right move, or what exactly he would do with the proof if he had it. His phone buzzed. "Valentina." He took the call. "Marcus said you needed to reach me," she said. Her voice had a quality he hadn't heard before, careful, slightly guarded. "What's going on?" "I need you to come here." "To the office?" "Dante," my father said. "What did your father say?" A pause. "He wants me to stay out of whatever is happening with your accounts until it's resolved. He said it's not the right time to tell me exactly what your father said." His voice was very flat. Another pause. Longer this time. "He said the Bellandi situation is bigger than we understood, and that until the picture is clearer, he doesn't want me involved." She paused again. "What's happening?" "Come to the office, Valentina." "I can't. My father specifically—" "Your father specifically what?" He stood up from the table. He was pacing now, a short, tight path between the window and the door. "Say it plainly." The silence on her end had a texture he recognized. The texture of a person navigating between two things and trying not to let you see them doing it. "He said not to come," she said finally. "He said until this is resolved, we should put things on hold." Dante stopped pacing. "On hold," he said. "It's temporary. It's just Carlo Rizzo is pulling back. He's being cautious. He's pulling back." Dante's voice was even. Extraordinarily even. "Because he did the math, and the math said that being associated with me right now carries a cost he's not prepared to pay." That's not what, Valentina." He stopped, pressed his free hand against the conference room glass, and looked at his reflection, the city behind it, the ordinary morning light. "Is this temporary? Genuinely. Is this something your father will revisit when things settle?" The pause was too long. Any answer that required that much pause was already an answer. "I don't know," she said quietly. He closed his eyes. "Open them." "I'll call you when things are clearer," he said. He hung up. He stood at the conference room window, with his hand still flat against the glass, and looked at his reflection, and understood, with the precision of something that had been building for days, and had now arrived completely, that he was standing in the middle of the ruin of everything he had spent 15 years building. Not at the edge of it, in the middle of it. Marcus appeared in the doorway. He looked at Dante at the window, and he didn't say anything for a moment. "The Rizzo family," Dante said without turning around. I know, there I heard. A pause, Dante. We should talk about options. What options? There are still assets that haven't been touched. Structures Bellandi might not have full visibility on. If we move fast, it won't matter. Dante turned from the window. He looked at Marcus, who had been with him for 4 years, who had built this alongside him, who was looking at him now with the expression of a man who was watching something end and had not yet decided whether to keep standing in the same place or start walking. Vittorio Bellandi didn't freeze accounts. He didn't do one thing. He built a machine over 5 years and he turned it on, and it's running. He walked to his desk, sat down. You can't outrun a machine that has a 5-year head start. Marcus was quiet. Did you pull the list I asked for? Dante said. The rooms Isabella sat in, the meetings, the dinners. Marcus pulled a folded page from his jacket pocket. He put it on the desk. 43 events over 4 years. Dinners, functions, business meetings she attended in a support capacity. He looked at the page. She was in the room when you discussed the Caruso arrangement, the Delaware structures, the Pelham property acquisition. He paused. She was present for a lot, Dante. Dante looked at the list without picking it up. Was she gathering it, he said, or did she just never forget it? Does the distinction matter right now? It matters to me. Marcus didn't answer that, which was, Dante thought, perhaps the most honest thing he could have done. The afternoon brought 3 more calls. The first was from the lawyer managing his real estate portfolio, who reported that 2 additional properties had received notices, one a zoning challenge that would freeze development, one a lease dispute filed by a tenant Dante had never had a problem with in 3 years. The second call was from a man named Doyle, who ran one of Dante's gambling operations on the outer edge of the Brooklyn network, who reported that 2 of his regular clients had independently informed him that they were, for various reasons, unable to continue their arrangements. The third call was from a contact at the city licensing office, who told him, with audible discomfort, that 2 of Dante's legitimate business licenses were under review for procedural compliance issues that had not been issues a month ago. Each call by itself was manageable. Together, they formed a pattern that was unmistakable to anyone who had spent 15 years building an empire and understood exactly what it looked like when an empire was being systematically taken apart from underneath. Dante stopped returning calls at 3 o'clock. He sent Marcus home at 4. He sat alone in the office until the light changed, and the city outside went from afternoon to evening without asking his permission, and he thought about a specific memory that had been surfacing and sinking all day without his consent. Isabella, 2 years into their marriage, at a dinner in a restaurant not unlike Fiora. His associate Brendan Marsh across the table, too much wine, talking about the Caruso structure in the loose, confident way that men talked when they felt safe. Isabella beside Dante, one hand in her lap, the other around her water glass. Not contributing to the conversation, not appearing to pay particular attention. Dante had not thought anything of it at the time. He thought about it now. He thought about 43 events, 5 years of dinners and rooms and quiet attention. He thought about the particular quality of Isabella's intelligence, not showy, not aggressive, not the kind that announced itself. The kind that absorbed, the kind that remembered, the kind that built a picture over time from pieces that individually looked harmless. He had called her ordinary. He had sat across from her on their anniversary and told her, in essence, that she was not enough for the world he had built. The world she had, apparently, understood better than he had. He picked up his phone. He looked at her contact again. The green circle was still there. He called her. It rang 4 times. He was preparing himself for voicemail when she answered. Dante. Her voice was neutral, the specific neutrality of someone who had been expecting the call and had decided in advance how to answer it. I know who your father is, he said. Silence. I know what he's done. I know the accounts, the properties, the federal documentation. He kept his voice even. I'm not calling to threaten you. I'm not calling to. He stopped. Started again. I need to understand something, the information he had, the specificity of it. He paused. Did you give it to him? The silence lasted long enough that he counted it. 6 seconds. 7. No, she said. Isabella, I never gave him anything. I never contacted him about your business. Not once in 5 years. Her voice was quiet and clear and direct. He's my father. He watches, he prepares. He built what he built because he didn't trust the world you operate in, and he was right not to trust it. A pause. But I never told him anything. That's the truth. Dante believed her. That was the thing he couldn't get past. He believed her, in the same way he'd believed for 5 years, that she was just a woman who loved him. You should have told me who you were, he said. Yes, she said simply. I should have. No defense, no elaboration, just that flat, clean acknowledgement that was its own kind of devastating. If I had known, what? Her voice didn't change. What would you have done differently, Dante? Would you have loved me differently, or would you have just managed me differently? A pause. I didn't tell you because I wanted to know which one it was going to be. And I spent 5 years finding out. He had no answer for that. My father is going to finish what he started, she said. I'm not asking him to stop. I'm not able to ask him to stop, and I don't think I would if I could. Another pause. Whatever you do next, that's your business. But if you're calling to ask me to intervene, the answer is no. I'm not asking you to intervene, he said. It was mostly true. Good. She paused. Is there something else? There was something else. There had been something else every hour for the past week, pressing at the back of his throat, a question he had been turning away from, because he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. On the night at the restaurant, he said slowly, before I put the envelope on the table, you came in with something to say. The quality of the silence changed. What were you going to tell me, he said. 14 seconds this time. He counted. Good night, Dante, she said. The line went dead. He held the phone. The office was dark now. He hadn't turned on lights, and the only illumination came from the city outside and the screen of the phone. He sat in that dimness and felt the weight of the 14-second silence settle on him with a specificity that was almost physical. She had been about to tell him something. Something significant enough that 14 seconds of consideration wasn't enough to make a decision about. He thought about her composure in the restaurant, the way she had folded the papers, the way she had walked out. He thought about the past 3 weeks and the things Pollard had found, and the morning in Westchester that he imagined now. Isabella walking into her father's house, sitting across from Vittorio Bellandi, whatever passed between them in that room. He thought about a woman who was 12 weeks pregnant. He didn't know this, had no way to know this, was operating entirely without this information, sitting in a restaurant, waiting to tell her husband the most significant thing she had to tell him, and watching him slide divorce papers across the tablecloth before she could open her mouth. He didn't know about the child. He only knew about the silence. But the silence was enough to understand that whatever Isabella had been about to say, it had not been small. He put his phone in his pocket and stood up in the dark office and did something he had not done since he was 22 years old and had nothing. He had no plan. For the first time in 15 years of building and calculating and positioning, Dante Moretti stood in the center of his own office, in the city he had spent 15 years learning to own, and he did not know what to do next. That was not the worst part. The worst part was the knock at his office door. He turned. The door opened. It was not Marcus. Marcus had gone home. It was not Ferraro. It was not anyone from his organization. It was a man Dante had never seen before. Late 50s. Silver hair, cut close. A dark overcoat and the specific quality of stillness that belonged to men who had been in rooms like this one, rooms where power lived for so long that the rooms no longer impressed them. Behind him, 2 other men. Position, not lurking, there was a difference, and Dante's body recognized it before his mind did. Mr. Moretti, the silver-haired man said. He had a low, unhurried voice. The voice of a man who had never needed to raise it to be heard. My name is Carver. I work for Vittorio Bellandi. He stepped into the office without being invited and looked around with a calm, evaluating attention. Mr. Bellandi would like to meet with you. Tonight, he looked at Dante directly. He asked me to extend the invitation personally and to tell you that it is genuinely an invitation. You are not compelled. A pause. But he believes you will want to come. Dante looked at the man named Carver. He looked at the 2 men behind him. He looked at his own office, the desk, the dark city windows, the chair where Marcus had sat this morning, looking like a man watching familiar ground shift. Where Dante said. Westchester, Carver said. Dante picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He had no plan and no leverage and no allies willing to stand in the same room as the name Bellandi, and the accounts were frozen and the properties were moving and the machine was running and had a 5-year head start. and Vittorio Bellandi was inviting him to a conversation. In the house where Isabella was living, Dante put on his jacket and followed Carver to the elevator and rode down in silence, and the city outside was doing what it always did, indifferent and enormous, and the car waiting at the curb was black and unmarked, and the door was held open, and he got in. The drive to Westchester took 40 minutes. Dante spent them in the back seat with his hands in his lap, and his jaw tight and his mind doing what it had always done under pressure, not shutting down, not spiraling, but going very still and very clear, like water that has been disturbed and is now settling. He thought about what Vittorio Bellandi might want to say to him. He thought about what he had left to bargain with. He thought about Isabella's voice on the phone. 14 seconds of silence. He thought about the question he should have asked years ago and hadn't, because asking it would have required him to believe that a person he was planning to keep could have a life he didn't know about, and he had not been a man who thought in those terms. The car turned through a gate. The house appeared in the headlights' modest exterior, well-maintained, the kind of house that didn't announce itself and didn't need to. Carver opened the door. Dante stepped out. The front door of the house opened before he reached it, and light spilled down the steps, and Vittorio Bellandi was standing in the doorway, with the specific bearing of a man receiving a guest in his own home, not aggressive, not welcoming, simply present, in the way that men like him were always present, which was completely and without apology. He was taller than Dante had expected. Older too, but the age sat on him differently than it did on most men, not diminishing him, but concentrating him. The way long pressure concentrates certain things into something harder and more deliberate than the original. He looked at Dante for a moment, then he stepped back from the door. "Come inside," he said. Dante walked up the steps. He crossed the threshold into Vittorio Bellandi's house and heard the door close behind him and understood with absolute clarity that whatever version of himself he had been when he arrived at this house, the man who had 15 years and a frozen empire and a phone call with 14 seconds of silence, was not the version that was going to survive what happened next. Something was about to end. He just didn't know yet which thing it was going to be. The study was at the back of the house. Vittorio Bellandi walked through his own hallways, the way a man walked through a space that had been his. For so long it had stopped being a place and become an extension of himself, without looking at anything, without needing to. His feet, finding the path between rooms with the automatic certainty of something that had been repeated 10,000 times. Dante followed 2 steps behind and said nothing, and looked at everything. The walls held framed photographs, family, mostly the kind of photographs that accumulated over decades, without anyone making a conscious decision to display them. A younger Vittorio in what looked like a restaurant, laughing at something off-camera. A woman Dante didn't recognize, dark-haired, with a quality around the eyes that he recognized immediately because he had looked at it across a dinner table for 5 years. Isabella's mother. Dead a long time, Dante knew that much from the fragments Isabella had offered over the years, which were not many. And then, near the end of the hallway, a photograph that stopped him. Isabella, maybe 1920, standing in a garden somewhere, squinting into the sun, one hand raised to shade her eyes. She was laughing at something, her whole face open in a way that he had seen occasionally in the first year of their marriage, and less frequently after that, and, he understood now, not at all in the last 2 years. He looked at it for 2 seconds, then he kept walking. The study had a large desk, 2 leather chairs positioned in front of it, and a single lamp that threw warm light across the room without reaching the corners. Books on the walls, actual books, the kind with cracked spines. A fireplace that was not lit. The room smelled like old paper, and something Dante associated specifically with the memory of powerful men, a smell he couldn't name precisely, but recognized as the accumulated residue of decades of decisions made in enclosed spaces. Vittorio moved behind the desk. He did not sit immediately. He stood with his hands resting on the back of his chair and looked at Dante with the particular attention Dante had been bracing. For since the car pulled through the gate, the attention of a man reading a document, evaluating its contents against a standard that had been established long before the document arrived. Dante stood in front of the desk. He didn't reach for the chair. "Sit down," Vittorio said. "I'm fine standing." A pause. Something shifted slightly in Vittorio's expression, not irritation, not quite. A recalibration. "Suit yourself." He sat. He moved the way old powerful men moved, without hurry, without the performance of ease that younger men sometimes deployed as a dominant signal. Just settling into the chair, because the chair was there and his body made decisions, now with the authority of long practice. He put his hands flat on the desk. "You know who I am," he said. "I do now," Dante said. "You knew who I was for 15 years before you knew who my daughter was." He looked at Dante steadily. "That is a fact I have thought about many times in the past 3 weeks." He paused. "You sat at tables I was aware of. You built operations in territory adjacent to mine. You made a name for yourself through methods I respected, if not the specific applications." He tilted his head slightly. "And in all that time, you never asked about Isabella's family. Never dug, never verified. She gave me no reason to dig." "No," Vittorio said. "She gave you every reason not to." He was quiet for a moment. "Daughter is not stupid, Mr. Moretti. She's the most intelligent person I know, including myself. And she wanted very badly to be loved by someone who loved her, without knowing what she came from." His voice was even throughout not warm, not cold, just direct. "She achieved that for a while." Dante's jaw was tight. He kept it tight because loosening it meant something would move in his face that he didn't want moving. "What do you want from this meeting?" he said. Vittorio looked at him. "I want you to understand the complete shape of your situation," he said. "Not because I owe you that, I don't, but because what happens next depends on whether you're capable of understanding it or not." He opened a folder on the desk. He didn't look at it. He knew what was in it. The accounts are frozen. The federal documentation is sufficient for indictment on 3 counts. The properties, you're aware. Your operational infrastructure is currently running on personnel loyalty and residual momentum, both of which have a limited half-life under the present conditions. He paused. The Rizzo family has retracted. You have no significant allies capable of acting on your behalf without exposing themselves to what is pointed at you. He closed the folder. That is the situation as of tonight. Dante looked at the man across the desk and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, which was the specific sensation of being in a room with someone who was unambiguously more powerful than him. He had been in rooms with dangerous men. He had been the dangerous man in rooms. But this was different. Vittorio Bellandi was not dangerous in the way that men with weapons were dangerous. He was dangerous the way systems were dangerous comprehensively, without needing to exert visible force. "You could have done this without the meeting," Dante said. "You had everything in place. You could have let it run." "Yes. So why am I here?" Vittorio was quiet for a moment. Turned the closed folder slightly on the desk, a small, precise movement. "Because Isabella is carrying your child," he said. "And that changes the geometry of what I'm willing to do." The sentence arrived in Dante's chest like something physical. He heard it. He processed the individual words. And then he stood very still for 3 seconds, while the meaning of them assembled itself into something his body understood, before his mind finished catching up. And the thing his body did was stop breathing for those 3 seconds, in the way that the body sometimes simply stops, when the information arriving is large enough to require the full available processing space. "What?" he said. Vittorio looked at him with the expression of a man who had expected this reaction and was giving it the space it required. "Isabella is pregnant," he said. "She has been for nearly 4 months." He paused. "She did not tell you. She made that decision the night you put the papers on the table, and she made it alone, and I have respected it." He held Dante's gaze. "I am telling you now because you have a right to know, and because decisions made without complete information produce consequences that are more complicated than they need to be." He paused again. "And because my daughter, whatever she decides going forward, deserves to make those decisions in a world that is not consumed by a war between you and me." Dante's hands were at his sides. He became aware of them at his sides. He became aware of the room, the lamp, the smell of pulled paper, the photograph in the hallway with Isabella at 19 laughing into the sun. 4 months. She had been pregnant at the restaurant. She had come to the restaurant with something to say, and he had put an envelope on the table before she could say it, and she had taken the papers and folded them, and put them in her purse, and walked out, and she had been pregnant. Something moved through Dante Moretti in that study that was not one thing. It was not guilt alone, and not grief alone, and not rage alone. It was all of them arriving simultaneously and finding no orderly way to exit, pressing against each other in the confined space of his chest until his next breath came out wrong, Ragged, a sound he would not have made in any other room in front of any other person. She was going to tell me, he said. His voice was not fully under control. For the first time in this conversation, for the first time in weeks, the control slipped. That night, she was going to tell me. Yes, Vittorio said. Simply, and I put the papers down before he stopped. The sentence didn't need finishing. Vittorio looked at him. The expression on the old man's face was not satisfaction. Dante had braced for satisfaction for the quiet pleasure of a powerful man watching a consequence land. Instead, what was on Vittorio Bellandi's face was something more complicated and less comfortable. Something that looked distantly like grief's practical cousin. Sit down, Mr. Moretti, he said. This time Dante sat. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor between his feet for a moment. The rug was old and dark red and worn through in one patch near the center. He looked at the worn patch and breathed. What do you want? He said to the floor. Then he looked up, specifically. From this meeting, from me, from whatever comes next. Do you want? Vittorio folded his hands on the desk. He looked at Dante with the focused attention of a man who had been waiting for the right question. I want my daughter to be safe, he said. Financially, physically, legally. I want her to build what she's going to build without the shadow of your criminal exposure falling on her or the child. He paused. I want the child, my grandchild, to grow up outside the world both of us built. He was quiet for a moment. And I want you to understand clearly and without ambiguity what you threw away. Not because I require your suffering, because decisions made by men who don't understand the full weight of them tend to repeat. Dante looked at him. The machine keeps running, he said. The machine keeps running, Vittorio confirmed. What you do inside that is your problem. You're not offering me a way out. No. Then what are you offering? Clarity. Vittorio stood. He moved to the side of the desk and stood with his arms crossed, looking at Dante with the same steady attention. And one boundary. You will not pursue Isabella through legal channels regarding the child. You will not use whatever attorneys you have left to complicate her life or create a custody dispute that puts my grandchild in the middle of your criminal exposure. His voice dropped one register. Not a threat, something quieter and more final than a threat. If you do that, what is currently running slowly will run faster. What is targeted narrowly will broaden, and what you have left will cease to exist in a time frame you will find unpleasant. He paused. That is not a negotiating position. That is the one thing I am telling you that is not open for discussion. Dante sat in the chair and looked at Vittorio Bellandi and felt, under everything else, a specific and terrible recognition. He was looking at what he had wanted to become. Not this man specifically, not Vittorio's methods or history, but the architecture of it, the reach, the capacity to protect the people who mattered by making the world arrange itself accordingly. The ability to sit in a room with someone who had come to threaten you and make them understand, without raising your voice, that there was no version of this conversation that ended badly for you. He had spent 15 years building toward that. He had walked out of Fiora thinking he was already there. He had been nowhere near it. I'm not going to go after the child, he said. That was never... He stopped. No. Good, Vittorio said. A silence that had a different quality than the previous silences, not the silence of negotiation, but the silence of something concluded. Then the study door opened, and Isabella was standing in the doorway. She was in a dark sweater and her hair was down, and she was visibly, unmistakably pregnant, in the way that she had not been the last time he saw her, the night at the restaurant, when she had folded his papers and walked out, and he had not known, could not have seen, what was already true about her body. She looked at her father first. Something passed between them that was not words, a question on her face, and to answer on his, the compressed communication of people who had known each other. Long enough that language was optional. Then she looked at Dante. He looked at her. The room was quiet enough that he could hear his own heartbeat, which was doing something irregular and counterproductive in the center of his chest. You told him, she said to her father. Her voice was flat. Not angry past the energy required for anger, and already somewhere more deliberate. Yes, Vittorio said. I asked you not to. You asked me to let the situation resolve itself without complete information on his part. Vittorio moved back behind his desk. I made a different decision. Isabella looked at her father with an expression Dante recognized from rooms where his own people had disappointed him, not rage. Because rage required energy, but the specific cold clarity of a person revising their understanding of what they could expect from someone. "You should have told me you were doing this," she said. "Yes," Vittorio said, "I should have." The acknowledgement landed cleanly. She took it. She turned back to Dante. He stood up. He didn't know why he stood up, some reflex, some physical imperative to not be sitting while she was standing. "Isabella, don't." Her voice was quiet, not a shout, not even close quiet, the way her voice always got when she was most serious. "Whatever you're going to say, don't. Not tonight." She looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face in 5 years, which was the expression of someone looking at a thing they have already grieved and are now simply observing. "You know now." "Okay, you know." She put one hand against her stomach, not theatrical, just present, the unconscious gesture of a woman whose body had reorganized itself around a new priority. "This doesn't change the papers. This doesn't change anything you said." "It changes everything," he said. The words came out rough. He hadn't planned them. No, she shook her head once. "It changes what you know. It doesn't change what you did." She looked at him for a moment longer. "You made your choice at that restaurant before I could say a word. Before you knew anything. That's who you were when it counted." She paused. "That's the information I needed." Dante felt the sentence enter him, the way certain sentences do, not as language but as physical sensation. Somewhere below the ribs, a pressure that didn't disperse. "I didn't know," he said. "If I had known—" "What?" Her voice was still quiet. "What would you have done, Dante? Stayed? Because of the baby?" She looked at him steadily. "That's worse. A man who stays because he has to is not the same as a man who stays because he wants to. It's not that simple." "It is exactly that simple." She wasn't raising her voice. "She didn't need to. You'd already decided I wasn't enough. A pregnancy doesn't change that. It just means you'd have been miserable with me for different reasons." The room was very quiet. Vittorio, behind his desk, was looking at a point on the wall above Dante's head with the careful attention of a man who had decided he was not present for this particular exchange. Dante looked at Isabella. She was standing in the doorway of her father's study, 4 months pregnant, looking at him with an expression that was not hateful and was not loving, and was something more difficult than either the expression of a woman who had arrived, at some cost, at a clear-eyed understanding of a situation, and who intended to live there. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "I know you are," she said. "Right now you are." She paused. "You'll be sorry for a while. That's not the same as having been different when it mattered." She looked at her father. "I'm going to bed. Whatever you two need to finish, finish it." She looked at Dante one last time. "My attorney will be in contact about the legal arrangements. Regarding the child, I'm not trying to keep you from knowing this person, but how that looks will be on my terms, and within structures that protect this baby from your current situation." She was quiet for a moment. "That's all I have to say." She turned and left. Her footsteps on the stairs were measured and unhurried. Dante stood in the study and listened to them until the house was quiet again, and then he looked at Vittorio Bellandi, who was looking back at him with the expression of a man who has just watched the inevitable happen and has no particular feelings about the fact of its inevitability. "She means it," Dante said. "Not a question. She always means it," Vittorio said. "That's the thing about Isabella. She always meant it." He paused. "Including the 5 years she spent beside you." Dante stood there for another moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on Vittorio's desk. It was the pen that had been sitting on top of the divorce papers in Fiora. He had kept it without thinking about it, the way you keep things that your hands touched at a significant moment. He had found it in his jacket pocket 3 days later and hadn't thrown it away. He looked at it on the desk. "For what it's worth," he said. Vittorio looked at the pen. He didn't touch it. "It's worth something," the old man said quietly. "It's just not enough." Dante nodded. He walked out of the study. Through the hallway with the photographs, pausing for 1 second at Isabella in the garden, at 19, laughing into the sun, the woman she had been, before she became the woman who folded his papers and walked out the door, and then through the front entrance and down the steps into the cold. The car was waiting. He got in. He sat in the back seat and did not speak and did not move, and the car rolled through the Westchester darkness toward the city. And somewhere in the house behind him, Isabella Bellandi was in a room with his child growing inside her, and she was going to sleep, and she was fine. Was the thing she was genuinely fine? in a way that had nothing to do with him, either as its source or its obstacle. She was fine without him. That was the thing that was going to take the longest to absorb. The drive back to Manhattan took 40 minutes again, and this time it felt like 4 hours, and also like nothing. Like the car was simply stationary, and the city was sliding toward him from a distance. And by the time the lights of the bridge appeared ahead, Dante Moretti understood, completely and without any remaining ambiguity, what he had done. Not the empire, not the accounts, not the properties, not the machine Vittorio had built and turned on. Those things were damage to structures. He had done damage to a person. A specific real person who had loved him in the way that people love, when they decide to love completely, not strategically, not conditionally, not with any portion of themselves held in reserve. She had loved him that way, and he had looked at it and called it ordinary. The city received him at the end of the bridge with its usual indifference, its noise and density and light. And his phone began to buzz immediately. Marcus Ferraro, a number he didn't recognize, and the practical emergency of his situation reasserted itself around him, like water rising in an enclosed space. He had to answer. He had to move. He had no plan and no leverage, in a federal case building, and a man in Westchester who had pressed a button 5 years in the making and was not going to press it again because he didn't need to. The machine was running and would run until it reached its endpoint, or until Dante made choices he had not yet figured out how to make. He answered. Marcus took, he said. 2 more things. Marcus's voice was tight. The Bronx distribution, it's gone. Someone moved in tonight. Not force, just occupation. The keys changed. Our people showed up and there were other people already there. A pause. And Ferraro called me. The federal warrant expanded this afternoon. They're looking at the legitimate businesses now. The restaurant group, the Realty LLC. Another pause. Dante. We're running out of structures to stand in. Dante looked out the car window at the city. I know, he said. What do we do? He thought about Isabella in the doorway. My terms. Within structures that protect this baby. Her hand on her stomach, unconscious, present. He thought about a pen on a desk in Westchester and a man who had looked at it and said, it's worth something. It's just not enough. Tomorrow, he said. Come in at 7. Bring Ferraro. He paused. We're going to talk about what's salvageable and what isn't. And we're going to be honest about the difference. And tonight, he looked at the city going past the window. Buildings he had looked at from this height for 15 years and called his city, his terrain, his... Tonight I'm going to sit in my apartment, he said, and think about how I got here. He hung up. The car moved through the city that had never actually been his, and Dante sat in the back with the specific quality of stillness that belongs to a man who has finally stopped moving fast enough to outrun what he's been running from. And the city lights moved across his face, and somewhere across that city, in a Westchester house, with a modest exterior and a very particular interior, Isabella Bellandi lay in the dark and put her hand on her stomach and felt the future push back against her palm, small and insistent, and completely indifferent to everything that had brought it here, wanting only what it had always wanted, which was simply to be born into a world where someone was ready to receive it. She was ready. He was not. That was the distance between them now, and it was not the distance of geography or legal papers or frozen accounts or the machinery of old powerful men. It was the distance between a person who had done the work of becoming and a person who had not yet started. And somewhere across the city, in an apartment full of the particular silence of a life that has been cracked open and not yet reassembled, Dante Moretti sat alone in the dark, with 15 years of empire collapsing around him, and a single fact that outweighed all of it pressing against the inside of his chest like something trying to get out. He was going to be a father, and he had no idea yet whether that was the thing that saved him, or the thing that finally completely showed him what he had become. The meeting with Marcus and Ferraro happened at 7:15 the next morning, in the conference room, the glass wall, the same room where the federal agents had sat with their folders 2 days before. Ferraro put 3 documents on the table. He didn't arrange them. He just put them down the way you put something down when you want the weight of it to be visible. Option 1, he said, we fight. Full legal resistance on all fronts. Challenge the warrant, dispute the compliance flags, contest the property actions. It buys time. 6 months, maybe a year before the federal case reaches a point of no return. He paused. It costs everything you have left in liquid assets. And at the end of it, The underlying case is still there. Dante looked at the first document. Option 2, Ferraro continued. Negotiated settlement on the federal exposure. You cooperate on the financial side, not on personnel, not on operations, just on the money structures, and in return the prosecution narrows its scope. You likely lose the accounts permanently. You take a fine. Possible probationary period, depending on what they decide to charge. He paused again. Criminal record. Minimal but real. And option 3, Dante said. Ferraro was quiet for a moment. He was a man of 60 who had spent 30 years in rooms like this one, and had the quality of someone who had long since stopped flinching at the conversations his profession required. Option 3 is that you walk away from the operational infrastructure entirely, voluntarily, ahead of the federal action. You cooperate fully, you divest completely, you document the dissolution of the network in a way that gives the government what they need to close the case without a prolonged prosecution. He looked at Dante. You lose everything that was built, but you don't go to prison. And depending on what you build after, there may be legitimate structures you can operate within 5 years from now. Marcus was sitting at the end of the table. He had not spoken since the meeting started. He had a coffee in front of him that he hadn't touched. Option 3, Dante said. Ferraro blinked once. You don't want to think about... I've been thinking about it since last night. Dante looked at the third document. What does cooperation look like, specifically? Ferraro looked at Marcus briefly, then back at Dante. Detailed financial disclosure, account structures, transaction histories, the shell architecture. All of it documented and handed over. He paused. You'll also need to account for the operational network. Not necessarily personnel, there's room to negotiate what that looks like. But the infrastructure itself. And my people, Dante said. Marcus, the others. We negotiate protections, no guarantees, but the scope of cooperation tends to determine the scope of the arrangement. Ferraro looked at him steadily. You understand that what I'm describing is the end of what you've built. Yes, Dante said. The room was quiet. Marcus picked up his coffee, set it down without drinking from it. He looked at the table surface for a moment, and then looked at Dante with an expression that was not surprised and was not wounded, and was something more honest than either the expression of a man who had been watching this ending approach for weeks and had not allowed himself to name it until someone else did first. 15 years, Marcus said. I know, you built this from nothing. From actually nothing. I was there, Dante. I was there when we had 2 guys and a car and a debt we couldn't cover. He paused. You're going to walk it all into a room and hand it over. Yes, because of Bellandi. Dante looked at Marcus. Because of a lot of things, he paused. Bellandi is the cause. But the actual reason, that's mine. He looked at his hands on the table. I've got a kid coming. I've got a federal case building. I've got an ex-wife who is Vittorio Bellandi's daughter and who will not be touched by whatever I do next because her father will not allow it. He looked up. The only question I can actually do anything about is what I look like in 5 years. What my kid looks like in 10. He paused. I can fight this and probably lose everything anyway. Or I can choose to put something down and see what's left underneath. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. All right, he said. I'll need you to stay through the transition. Help me document it accurately. Dante looked at him directly. After that, what you do is your own. I know, Marcus said. Ferraro picked up the third document. He uncapped a pen and slid it toward Dante. This initiates the preliminary conversation with the federal team. It doesn't commit you to anything, yet it opens the door. He paused. Once you open it, closing it gets complicated. Dante picked up the pen. He thought about a different pen sitting on a desk in Westchester in the lamplight. Worth something. Just not enough. He signed his name on the document. His handwriting was the same, as it had always been slightly too large for the line, not quite contained. He'd never bothered fixing it. He capped the pen, slid the document back. Set up the meeting, he said. The federal negotiation took 11 weeks. They were 11 weeks of conference rooms and legal language, and the precise grinding work of dismantling something complex, not dramatically, not with the violence that had characterized the building of it, but in the slow, documented, painstaking way that legal processes required. Every account, every structure, every transaction history going back 12 years. Ferraro managed it with the focused intelligence of a man who had spent 30 years building toward exactly this kind of problem. And Dante sat through every meeting and answered every question and handed over every piece of documentation that was asked for without the performance of reluctance. He had decided to do this, and so he was doing it. That was the only way he knew how to be. By the end of week 11, the federal case against Dante Moretti had been resolved through a cooperation agreement that cost him the full operational infrastructure, the frozen accounts, 3 properties, and a civil penalty that would take years to pay down. In return, he received no criminal charges on the substantive counts, a 2-year period of financial monitoring, and the specific, narrow freedom of a man who had emerged from something at significant cost and was now standing in the aftermath looking at what remained. What remained was an apartment he could no longer afford, a reputation that existed in 2 very different registers, depending on who was reading it, and the particular silence of a life that had been stripped of its architecture. He moved out of the penthouse on a Thursday morning. He packed himself, which took less time than he expected because it turned out that 15 years of accumulated presence in a space produced less that was actually his than he had assumed. Clothes, books he hadn't opened in years, a photograph of his parents that he'd kept in a desk drawer and never hung on a wall. The building manager held the elevator for him. He thanked her. She looked faintly surprised by the thank you, which told him something about who he had been in this building. He moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a building in Astoria that did not have a doorman or a view of anything particular. The rent was manageable on what he had left. The 2nd bedroom was empty. He left it empty. Isabella had called Ferraro 3 weeks into the federal negotiation. Not Dante Ferraro. The conversation, as Ferraro reported it, was brief and practical. She wanted to understand the legal scope of the cooperation agreement as it related to the child. Whether Dante's arrangement with the federal government created any complications for a custody arrangement. Whether the financial monitoring period affected support structures. Ferraro reported back that she had been very precise in her questions and entirely unemotional in the delivery of them. She knows what she's doing, he told Dante. I know, Dante said. A letter arrived from her attorney 6 weeks after that. Proposed terms for a parenting arrangement. Primary residence with Isabella. Dante to be informed of the child's birth, and after a period of demonstrated stability on his part, to have structured visitation rights. No financial claim on Dante beyond a modest support figure that was calibrated to what he could actually sustain, not to what he had once had. A request that both parties submit to a brief mediated conversation before the child arrived, to establish communication protocols. He read the letter 3 times. Then he called his own attorney and said, "Tell them yes to all of it." His attorney paused. "All of it? We could negotiate the visitation structure." "Yes to all of it," Dante said. The mediated conversation happened in February, in a neutral office on the East Side run by a woman named Dr. Chen, who had the particular quality of someone who had sat between estranged parents many times and had long since stopped having opinions about who was wrong. Isabella arrived first. She was 7 months pregnant and wearing a gray coat that she had not yet fully unbuttoned when Dante came in, and she looked at him the way she had in the doorway of her father's study, not with hostility, not with warmth, with the clear, steady attention of someone who had organized their feelings about a situation and was now operating from within that organization. He sat across from her at the small conference table. Dr. Chen was at the head of it. He looked at Isabella and felt the specific, uncomfortable weight of a man looking at something he had underestimated so severely that the full extent of the underestimation would still driving in pieces weeks later. She looked well, not performing wellness actually well, in the particular way that came from having made a decision and lived inside it long enough that the decision had become architecture. "Hello, Dante," she said. "Isabella," he paused. "You look," he stopped. Started over. "How are you feeling?" "Fine." She put her hands on the table. "Good, actually." She looked at him steadily. "You look tired." "I am," he said. The honesty of it seemed to land. Something shifted slightly in her expression, not softening exactly, but acknowledging. Dr. Chen opened the session. She was efficient and non-intrusive, and let the conversation find its own level, which it did, slowly, in the way that conversations between people with serious history find levels haltingly, with wrong starts, with silences that the mediator let sit. They talked about the child for 40 minutes, practical things. communication, how Dante would be notified when labor began, what information he would receive, what the first year would look like, how visitation would build, what demonstrated stability looked like in practice. He answered every question directly and without negotiation. She noted his answers without comment. Near the end, Doctor. Chen stepped out briefly and they were alone. The room was quiet. The cooperation agreement, Isabella said. You didn't have to go that far. I know. Ferraro said you didn't push back on anything. That you volunteered information they weren't even asking for. It seemed like the right way to do it. He looked at her. If I was going to put it down, I wanted to put all of it down. She looked at him for a moment. Why? He thought about how to answer that. Not the version that sounded considered, and intentional, the true version, which was messier. Because I had a kid coming, he said, and I didn't want the first thing my kid inherited from me to be the specific way I made excuses for myself. He paused. That's it. That's the whole reason. She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved through her expression, complicated, real, not quite what he'd have called forgiveness, and not quite what he'd call something else. Just recognition. The particular recognition of someone hearing an honest thing. Okay, she said. Dr. Chen came back. They finished the session. They signed the preliminary communication agreement. They both stood at the same time, the way you stand when a formal thing is concluded. He held the door for her. She walked through it without looking back, which was not coldness. It was just the particular way she moved through the world now, forward without checking to see if anyone was watching. He stood in the doorway and watched her walk down the hall toward the elevator and thought, there it is. That's who she became. He had asked her once, early in their marriage, what she wanted out of the future. She had thought about it for a real moment, not the performance of thinking, but actual consideration, and she had said, I want to be useful. I want to build something that matters after I'm gone. He had thought she meant a family. She had meant something larger. He understood that now. Matteo Bellandi was born on a Tuesday morning in March, at 7:42, 6 weeks after the mediation session. Dante received the text from Isabella's number 3 words. No punctuation. He's here. Healthy. He sat with his phone in his hand in the Astoria apartment for a long time after that. Then he got up and put on his jacket and went outside and walked for 2 hours through a neighborhood he was still learning, past bodegas and a park, with a broken fountain and a bakery that smelled like something complicated and sweet, and he walked until his legs had the good tiredness of actual movement rather than the bad tiredness of a man sitting still inside a collapsing thing. He visited the hospital the following day, for 15 minutes, as agreed. Isabella was sitting up in the bed, and the baby was in a transparent bassinet beside her, and Vittorio Bellandi was standing near the window, with his hands clasped behind his back, and the room had a specific quality that Dante stepped into carefully, not his space, not his moment, a space he was allowed to be in briefly and at a specific angle. He stood at the bassinet. Matteo was very small and very red and had Isabella's shape around the eyes and Dante's width across the forehead, and was completely unconscious of the complicated world that had produced him, which seemed in the moment like the most accurate and correct response available. Dante stood there for a moment and looked at him. He didn't touch him. That felt like something that needed to be earned over time rather than taken in a hospital room. But he stood there and looked at his son's face and felt something organize itself inside him that had been scattered and formless for months. Not joy exactly, not in the simple sense, but something more durable than joy. A sense of something that required him to be better than he had been. Not as an aspiration, but as a practical necessity. He looked up at Isabella. "Thank you for letting me come," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Matteo. "He should know you," she said. "Whatever happened between us, he should know his father." She paused. "That's on you to build. I'm not going to build it for you," he said. He looked at Vittorio, who looked back at him with the steady, evaluating attention that had not changed since the study in Westchester. They did not speak. They did not need to. Something passed between them that was not reconciliation, and was not enmity and acknowledgement, perhaps, of the specific strange position they now occupied relative to each other, and relative to the small unconscious person in the bassinet who connected them permanently, and without either of their permissions. Dante stayed 15 minutes. He left when he said he would leave. The next 3 years were quiet in the way that things are quiet after a storm has passed and the landscape has reorganized itself around the absence of what was destroyed. Quiet was not the same as easy. Quiet was not the same as fine. He worked. He had taken a job not glamorous, not criminal, not a shadow of what he'd built with a mid-sized logistics company in New Jersey that needed someone who understood how supply chains actually operated at the level where decisions got made. He had walked in with a resume that was largely fictional and an understanding of operational complexity that was entirely genuine. And the man who ran the company had looked at him across a desk and said, with the directness of someone who respected it in others, "You've done things I'm not going to ask about. Can you do this?" "Yes," Dante had said. "Don't make me regret it." He hadn't. He was not good at the job the way he had been good at building an empire. He was adequate at first, and then competent, and then better than competent, and the learning of it had a texture that 15 years of running his own operation had not provided, the texture of being answerable to someone else's standard, of having to justify decisions, of existing within constraints rather than setting them. He found he didn't hate it. He saw Matteo every other Saturday, in the framework that Isabella's attorney had built, and that held its shape because both parties let it hold its shape. He picked the boy up from the Westchester house he had been inside its front hallway 6 times over 3 years and had never been invited further, and they went to the park, or a museum or a diner, where Matteo ordered the same thing every time, which was pancakes with too much syrup, and ate them with the focused intensity of a small person, for whom pancakes were a serious undertaking. Matteo at 2.5 was direct, curious, and had a quality around the mouth when he was thinking that was identical to a quality Dante had seen in the mirror his entire life, which he found both disorienting and grounding. At 3, Matteo began asking why things worked, not the surface version of the question, but the actual one. Why does the elevator move? Why is the sky that color in the evening? Why does the dog across the street make that sound when it sees birds? Dante answered as honestly as he could, and when he didn't know the answer, he said so, and they looked it up together on his phone. And Matteo seemed to find this, the looking things up together, the acknowledgement of not knowing, more satisfying than a confident wrong answer would have been. Dante filed that away. It told him something about the boy that he intended to remember. He did not try to rebuild. Whatever people expected from a man who had run a significant criminal operation for 15 years, nostalgia for the power, attempts to recapture it, the pull of old alliances he felt, if anything, the opposite. The structures were gone, and the people had scattered, and the specific weight of the life he'd built had distributed itself across the past like sediment, and what was left when you removed the weight was not nothing. But it was something considerably harder to see, and considerably more worth the looking. He was not at peace with what he had done. That seemed on balance correct. A man at peace with having thrown away his marriage and his child's early years for a status ambition that turned out to be constructed on sand was not a man who had understood anything. So he was not at peace. He lived with it the way you lived with a specific physical limitation, accounting for it, working around it, not pretending it wasn't there. Isabella built what she had said she would build. He knew this not from her directly, but from the footprint of it, which was visible in the world and growing. She took the development director position at the Bellandi Foundation, and within 18 months had restructured its grant-making framework, expanded its healthcare access programs into 3 new communities, and brought in 2 corporate partners whose names meant something. She was, by every account that reached him, through the neutral channels of professional reputation, extremely good at it. She also met someone. He learned this in the way that you learned things about a person you were no longer with, but had not fully separated from, gradually, in pieces, from context that accumulated over time. A name mentioned in a logistical email from her attorney. A passing reference from Matteo, who was matter-of-fact about the adults in his life in the way that small children were matter-of-fact about arrangements they had never known to be otherwise. The man's name was Adrian. He worked in architecture. He was, by Matteo's account, good at building things out of blocks, which was the specific currency of judgment available to a 3-year-old, and which Dante accepted as the most relevant data point. He had no right to feel anything about this, and he made a genuine, sustained effort not to feel anything about it. And he was only partially successful, which seemed to him the appropriate and honest result of the effort. The October morning in Central Park happened the autumn. Matteo turned 4. Dante was there because he had started going to the park on Saturday mornings, not the ones when he had Matteo, but the in-between ones, as a habit he'd developed, in the way you develop the habits of a person who is no longer managing an empire and has instead to manage the ordinary architecture of a day. He ran. He had started running, which he had never done before, because it turned out that the body needed somewhere to put the energy that used to go into building and managing and controlling, and running was a place that absorbed it without consequence. He was sitting on a bench near the water at 9:40, cooling down when he saw them. Isabella was 20 feet away, in a dark coat, her hair pulled back. She was not looking in his direction. She was watching something ahead of her, her face carrying the particular expression of a mother, tracking a child's movement in a public space alert, present, slightly preoccupied. Matteo was running toward the water. Running the way 4-year-olds ran, which was with the unedited commitment of someone had not yet learned that the ground could be unpredictable, and then the ground was unpredictable. And Matteo went down not badly. A trip, a stumble. The knees hitting the path and the crying started immediately, the specific crying of a child who is more surprised than hurt. Dante was off the bench before he had consciously decided to move. He was closer than Isabella, closer by 10 feet, positioned by random chance at exactly the wrong angle for what followed. He reached Matteo first. He crouched down and got his hands under the boy's arms and lifted him back to his feet. And Matteo, with his eyes scrunched shut and his hands in fists at his sides, and Dante said quietly, "Hey! Hey, you're okay, look at me." Matteo opened his eyes. They were Isabella's eyes in Dante's face, or Dante's face around Isabella's eyes. The combination of two people in one person, which was what children were the irreducible evidence of a moment when two people had been close enough to make something that outlasted the closeness. Matteo looked at him. "Your knees okay?" Dante said. Matteo looked down at his knees. They were dirty but unbloodied. He looked back up. He nodded once with the gravity of a child who has made an assessment and is reporting it accurately. "Good," Dante said. "You're all right." He stood. He released the boy. He took 2 steps back to restore the distance that the moment had closed. Isabella was there. She moved between them with the instinct of a mother and pulled Matteo against her hip and looked at Dante over the boy's head. And the look that passed between them was not the look from the restaurant, not the look from the hospital room, not the look from the mediation session. It was something quieter and more settled, the look of two people who had arrived, at significant cost, at a version of the truth about each other. Matteo had stopped crying. He was looking at Dante with the direct, unmediated attention of a 4-year-old who had not yet been taught to be polite about staring. "Thank you," Isabella said. "It's fine," Dante said. A silence. The park moved around them, other people, other children, the ordinary motion of an October morning. "Are you?" she started. "I'm fine," he said. "I was running. Just cooling down." He looked at Matteo, who was still looking at him. "He's got good balance, usually." "He does," she said. Another silence. "I'm sorry," he said. Not the word in the abstract, not the wide, general shape of it. He meant something specific, and she knew what he meant, and he knew she knew, and neither of them dressed it further. She held his gaze for a moment. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while," she paused. "That's not the same as it being enough. But I know." He nodded. Matteo looked up at his mother. "Mama, who is that?" Isabella looked down at her son. She looked back at Dante, and something passed through her expression, complicated, honest, finally, irreversibly honest. "Someone who helped you," she said. "What do you say?" Matteo looked at Dante with the serious, formal courtesy of a 4-year-old who had been taught manners and deployed them with deliberate effort. "Thank you for helping me," he said. Dante looked at his son. "You're welcome," he said. Matteo seemed satisfied with this exchange and turned his attention to something else, a duck near the water's edge, or the specific shape of a cloud, or whatever it was that 4-year-olds turned their full attention to next. The moment passed. The moment was over. Isabella looked at Dante one last time. It was not the look of someone who had forgiven everything or forgotten anything. It was the look of someone who had decided that this moment, and what it contained, was sufficient for what it was, a small thing in a park on an ordinary morning. Two people who had made something together and then failed each other, and were now navigating what remained, which was the child. And the child was enough to build something functional on, even if it was not the thing either of them had originally built toward. Take care of yourself, she said, simply. She meant it. You too, he said. She turned. Matteo took her hand and they walked, and then from the direction of the boathouse a man appeared, Adrian. Dante understood, without needing to be told, and Matteo released Isabella's hand and ran toward him, with the particular acceleration of a child running toward someone who received them completely, and the man lifted him easily, laughing, and Isabella moved to stand beside him, with her hand resting against his shoulder, in the way that a person's hand rests against the shoulder of someone who is simply plainly there. Dante stood and watched the three of them. He stood there for a long moment. Then he turned and started walking. Not running, walking slowly, on the park path that wound between the trees. The light was that specific autumn light that came at this angle only in October, the kind that made everything it touched look deliberate, considered, as though the world had been composed with some purpose in mind, even if that purpose was obscure. He walked and he did not look back. What he carried with him was not nothing. It was also not the thing he had carried 15 years before, when he had been building, when he had believed that power was the thing that made you safe, and that status was the thing that made you real, and that the woman beside him was simply a feature of the life he was constructing, rather than a person who had chosen him when he was. Not yet worth choosing, and loved him for longer than he deserved, and been honest with him, finally, about what he was and what he had cost her. He carried the weight of all of that, and it was the appropriate weight, and he was not going to put it down. What he was going to do was carry it, and keep walking, and on alternating Saturdays pick up his son and take him to eat pancakes with too much syrup and answer his questions honestly and say he didn't know when he didn't know and look it up and learn. Alongside him. And that was going to have to tee the shape of what he built from here. It was smaller than what he had built before. It was real in a way that what he had built before had never been. The park received him and released him, and the city waited its edges, ordinary and enormous, and Dante Moretti walked through the October morning with his hands in his pockets and his face to the light and the long, specific work of becoming something other than what he had been still ahead of him, still incomplete, still requiring his full and unguarded attention. He had no soldiers behind him, no empire, no title, no woman who loved him in that way anymore. He had a son who thanked him with formal 4-year-old courtesy for helping him off the ground. He had decided that this was where he started, not where he finished, where he started. And for the first time in 15 years of building in the wrong direction, he put one foot in front of the other and walked toward something he hadn't constructed in advance and couldn't control and had no blueprint for, and the morning light fell across him without judgment as he went. He walked out of the park at the 72nd Street exit and kept going. No destination. That was new or new enough that he still noticed it. The absence of forward planning, the strange lightness of a man who was not moving toward anything specific, and was not for the first time in a long time disturbed by that. He had spent 15 years always moving towards something. A deal, a meeting, a position, the next level of the thing he was building. The momentum of it had been its own kind of drug, and the withdrawal from it had been uglier than he'd expected and quieter than he'd feared. And he was somewhere on the other side of it now, in the territory that came after, which had no name he knew. He walked south along Columbus Avenue. The Saturday morning crowd moved around him, families with strollers, couples with coffee, a teenager on a skateboard who navigated the sidewalk with the confidence of someone who had never yet believed they could fall. Dante moved through all of it at a pace that was his own, unhurried, his hands in the pockets of his jacket, and his breath making small clouds in the October air. He thought about Matteo's face, the specific look of a 4-year-old who has been helped up off the ground and is making a solemn assessment of his knees. The seriousness of it, the complete unself-consciousness of it. There was no performance in a 4-year-old's seriousness. It was just the actual weight they gave to things, uncalibrated by the social pressures that arrived later and taught you which emotions to display in public and in what proportions. Matteo had looked at his knees and determined they were acceptable and reported this finding, with the authority of someone delivering a verdict. Dante had spent 38 years in rooms full of men performing authority, and he had never seen anyone do it as cleanly as a 4-year-old, who had just decided his knees were fine. He stopped at a coffee cart on the corner of 68th and ordered a black coffee and stood on the sidewalk drinking it and watched the street do what streets did on Saturday mornings, which was be full of people who were somewhere between where they'd been and where they were going, temporarily in motion, temporarily between things. He thought about Vittorio Bellandi. He had not spoken to the man since the night in the study in Westchester. He had not expected to. Their relationship, if that was the word for what existed between them, which it probably wasn't quite existed entirely through the arrangements that lawyers and mediators had built between them, and those arrangements functioned, because both parties had functioned, because both parties allowed them to function, which was, of course, the only practical piece available to two men who had done what they had done to each other. But he thought about him sometimes. He thought about the photograph of Isabella on the hallway wall, 19 years old, laughing into the sun. He thought about the kind of man who built a machine over 5 years, not out of aggression, but out of preparation, who hoped the machine would never need to run and ran it when it needed to, and felt. Dante suspected nothing particularly triumphant about it. He thought about what it meant to love someone the way Vittorio loved Isabella, not the consuming, claiming love that Dante had mistaken for depth, but the love that built infrastructure quietly and waited and prepared, and then, when necessary, acted completely, without hesitation, and then stepped back. It was, he thought, a more demanding kind of love than any he had practiced. He finished the coffee. He put the cup in a trash can and kept walking. A year after the morning in the park, he transferred to a different division at the logistics company, one that dealt with international coordination, supply chain problem, solving in markets where the infrastructure was unreliable, and the solutions required someone who understood how operations actually held together under pressure. He was good at this in a way that surprised his supervisors and did not particularly surprise him, because the skills required were not so different from the skills he had spent 15 years developing, only pointed in a direction that did not end with federal agents in conference rooms. His manager, a woman named Doris, who had been doing this work for 22 years, and had the patience of someone who had long since stopped expecting perfection from anyone, told him at his annual review that he was, in her specific phrasing, unnecessarily difficult and genuinely excellent, and that these qualities unfortunately came as a set, and she had decided to keep the set. He told her he appreciated her candor. She told him to stop talking like that, or people would think he was being sarcastic. He laughed. It surprised them both. He was not. In the years that followed, a man transformed in the clean, simple way that stories sometimes described transformation the single moment of clarity that reorganized everything. The revelation that arrived like light through a window and changed the whole room. He was instead a man who had changed the way most people changed, which was incrementally, reluctantly, through the accumulated pressure of consequences and the slow, uncomfortable work of accounting for himself honestly. He still had the instincts of the man he had been. The reading of rooms, the assessment of threat, the particular attention to who was looking at what and from which angle. He still reached sometimes for the old tools, the controlled distance, the managed impression, the instinct to position rather than simply be present. These were not things that disappeared. They were things that got slower, less automatic, gradually subject to a delay between impulse and action in which a question could insert itself. The question was usually simple. The question was usually, is this who you are now, or is this who you were? He did not always choose correctly, but he asked the question, which was different from before. Matteo at 5 had a specific laugh, a laugh that arrived without warning and was gone just as quickly like weather. He had Isabella's deliberateness around making decisions, and Dante's inability to sit still when he was thinking, and he had things that were purely his own, qualities that had arrived from nowhere either of them could identify, which was the part of a child that was the most honest argument for the reality of a separate personhood. He started calling Dante Papa when he was 4.5. Not because anyone suggested it. He simply began doing it one Saturday afternoon over pancakes, mid-sentence, without announcement. And Dante had looked up from his coffee and felt something move through him that had no name in any language he knew, but that was large enough to require a moment before he could continue the conversation normally. He had continued it normally. He had driven home that evening and sat in his apartment in Astoria for a long time, in the quiet of a life that was smaller than the one he had built, and more honestly his, and he had thought about the word, and what it required of him, and whether he was equal to what it required. He was not yet equal to it. He intended to become equal to it. That was the work. That was what remained. Outside his apartment window, the city moved through its ordinary motions, noise, and light, and the constant lateral motion of people going somewhere, always somewhere, the city's permanent and democratic restlessness. He had once looked at cities from above and believed that what he saw was his. He looked at this city now from a second-floor window in Astoria and understood it as something he lived inside, not something he possessed. And the difference between those two things was he had come to believe the whole distance between the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. He was not finished. He was not absolved. He was not at peace. He was present, which was the thing he had never managed to be when it counted, and which was, it turned out, the only place where anything real could actually be built. He turned away from the window. He had a book on the table that Matteo had left behind last Saturday, a picture book about how bridges worked, full of cross-section diagrams and the specific, earnest language of children's nonfiction. Matteo had been deeply interested in it and had left it by accident, and had called him on the phone, very seriously, to confirm it was safe and would be returned next Saturday. Dante had confirmed, with equal seriousness, that the book was safe. He picked it up now. He sat down with it in the chair by the window. He opened it to the first page, where there was a diagram of a suspension bridge, with all its tension lines labeled. He read it, not for Matteo, not as preparation for a conversation, just because it was there, and it was a Saturday, and there was nowhere he needed to be. And he was, for the first time in his life, a man with time enough to read a children's book about bridges, and nothing more urgent pressing in from any direction. He read it to the end. Then he set it on the table, beside his coffee, in the quiet of the ordinary afternoon, and he sat with it for a moment, the diagrams, the tension lines, the careful explanation of how something held together under pressure that should by all accounts destroy it. And he thought that this was in its way the only kind of engineering worth doing, the kind that held,